Before the gold-plated tour buses, before the platinum records, there was just dust. The red dirt of South Carolina, the cotton dust of poor textile mills. That's where Tommy Caldwell was born, and that's where fate forged him into an unstoppable tank. He was the backbone of the Marshall Tucker Band, the man who turned the rhythm of a textile mill into the pulse of rock and roll. But no backbone can break. At 30, Tommy was gone, leaving a void that no sound could fill. This story is a brutal testament to a truth. A band can survive without a singer, but it will die instantly without a heart. Spartanburg was known as Hub City for the railroads that sliced through it like spokes on a wheel. But the town's true engine wasn't the train, it was the factory. This wasn't the genteel South of porch swings and sweet tea. This was the industrial South, a landscape built on steel and sweat. Life here was commanded by the shift whistle. It was a world of deafening mechanical rhythm where men and women traded their youth for a paycheck, working in an environment that didn't just employ them, it hardened them. It was into this world of hard edges and rigid expectations that Tommy Caldwell was born on November 9th, 1949. He was the second son of the Caldwell family. To understand Tommy, you have to understand the shadow he was born into. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean the protective, towering presence of his older brother, Toy Caldwell. Toy was born 2 years earlier, in 1947. In the mythology of the Caldwell family, Toy was the fire. He was the extrovert, the one with the restless hands and the burning eyes. Tommy, from the very beginning, was the earth. He was the quiet one, the observer, the one who watched the fire and made sure it didn't burn the house down. The Caldwell household was a sanctuary from the industrial grind outside, and the altar of that sanctuary was the radio. You have to imagine the sonic landscape of South Carolina in the 1950s. It was a unique crossroads. During the day, the airwaves were dominated by the Grand Ole Opry, broadcasting the high, lonesome sounds of country music from Nashville. It was Hank Williams. It was bluegrass. It was music that spoke to the rural white working class, stories of heartbreak, whiskey, and redemption. But at night, the signal changed. When the sun went down and the atmospheric conditions shifted, the radio dial in Spartanburg could catch signals drifting up from the deep South, from Memphis, from New Orleans, and from stations like WLAC in Nashville that played race records. This was the secret education of the Caldwell brothers. Lying in their beds in the dark, they heard the driving rhythm and blues of the Delta. They heard the electric mud of Howlin' Wolf and the intricate, sophisticated jazz of the big bands. Most kids in Spartanburg picked a side. You were country or you were something else. The Caldwell boys didn't choose. They devoured it all. They didn't know they were supposed to segregate their ears. To them, the twang of a pedal steel guitar and the honk of a saxophone were just different dialects of the same language. This musical bilingualism, this ability to speak both country and jazz, would become the secret weapon of the Marshall Tucker Band. But long before there was a band, there was just a father, a mother, and 2 boys trying to make a noise of their own. Music was a trade in the Caldwell family, almost like carpentry or plumbing. It wasn't treated as a high art to be studied in a conservatory. It was something you did with your hands. Toy Caldwell picked up the guitar first, and almost immediately it was clear that he wasn't playing it like everyone else. Toy had a strange idiosyncratic style. He played with his thumb. He didn't use a plastic pick. He used the fleshy part of his thumb to pluck the bass notes and his fingers to snap the treble strings, creating a sound that was meaty, percussive, and incredibly fast. It was a style born of intuition, not instruction. And where was Tommy? He was right there, watching, listening. There is a psychological phenomenon often seen in famous musical siblings. You have the older prodigy, the star, and then you have the younger brother. The younger brother has a choice. He can compete, try to be louder and faster, usually leading to conflict. Or he can choose a different path. He can choose to support. Tommy Caldwell chose the bass. It was a decision that revealed his character before he even played a note. The bass is not a glory instrument. In the 1950s and 60s, the bass player was often the failed guitarist, the guy who stood in the back. But for Tommy, the bass was a way to be in the music without having to be the center of attention. It was a way to lock in with his brother. Toy needed a foundation. His thumb-picking style was wild, improvisational, and sometimes erratic. He needed someone who could anticipate his moves, someone who knew his internal rhythm before he even struck the note. Who better than the boy who shared his room? Who better than the brother who had listened to the same radio programs, breathed the same air, and eaten at the same table? As the 1960s rolled in, the world cracked open. The British invasion arrived, the Beatles, the Stones, the Yardbirds. Suddenly, every kid in America wanted to be in a rock and roll band. Spartanburg was no exception. The Caldwell brothers were teenagers now, and the garage became their laboratory. They weren't just playing country standards anymore. They were trying to figure out how to make their guitars sound like the records coming out of London and Liverpool. But here is where the geography of Spartanburg becomes crucial again. While the kids in New York or Los Angeles were looking forward, trying to be psychedelic, the boys in Spartanburg were still looking back. They couldn't shake the country influence. They couldn't shake the blues. They formed bands with names that are now lost to history, playing the local circuit, the VFW halls, the high school gymnasiums, the roadhouses on the edge of town, where the chicken wire was wrapped around the stage to protect the band from flying beer bottles. This was the Chitlin circuit of the rock world. It was a brutal, unforgiving education. You had to play for 4 hours a night. You had to play the hits. If you played an original song, you risked getting booed off stage. You had to make people dance, and you had to keep them drinking. Tommy Caldwell grew up on these stages. He wasn't learning music theory from a book. He was learning crowd control. He was learning stamina. He was learning that if the bass and the drums stop, the dancing stops. And if the dancing stops, you might get beaten up in the parking lot. By the late 1960s, the brothers had formed a group called the Toy Factory. It's a name that sounds almost quaint now, a nod to the industrial nature of their hometown and the brilliance of the older brother. But the Toy Factory was a serious endeavor. This was the incubator. This was where the chemistry began to bubble. They were joined by other local musicians who were floating in the same orbit. There was George McCorkle, a rhythm guitarist who played with a steady metronomic precision that allowed Toy to wander. There was Doug Gray, a local singer with a voice that could peel paint off the walls, high, clear, and dripping with soul. And there was Jerry Eubanks. Jerry was the anomaly. He played the flute and the saxophone. In 1968, Spartanburg, bringing a flute to a rock gig was an act of bravery. It signaled that these boys weren't just trying to be a cover band. They were hearing something different in their heads. They were imagining a sound that merged the grit of the mill town with the sophistication of jazz. But looming over all of this youthful ambition was the reality of the era, the Vietnam War. Like thousands of other young American men, the shadow of the draft hung over the Caldwells. The Toy Factory was interrupted. Life was put on hold. The brothers served their time, Toy in the Marines, where he was wounded in Vietnam, an experience that would darken his songwriting and add a layer of trauma to his thumb-picked melodies. Tommy managed to stay stateside, but the separation was difficult. For the first time, the brothers were apart. Tommy continued to play, honing his chops, keeping the dream alive while the world seemed to be tearing itself apart on the nightly news. When Toy returned from the war, he was different. He was harder. He had seen the jungle and the darkness. He had songs in him now that weren't just about girls and cars. He had songs about survival, about longing for home, about the desert and the mountain, and Tommy was there waiting for him. The bass was tuned. The foundation was ready. The year is 1970. The psychedelic 60s are crashing into the hard reality of the 70s. The Beatles have broken up. Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin are dead. The optimism of Woodstock has turned into the cynicism of Altamont. But down in the South, something is stirring. In Macon, Georgia, the Allman Brothers Band is rewriting the rules of rock music. They are proving that you can play long improvised solos, mix blues and jazz, and still sell records. In Spartanburg, the Caldwell brothers looked at each other and realized, we can do that, and we can do it our way. They reconvened the troops, Doug Gray, George McCorkle, Jerry Eubanks, and they found a drummer named Paul Riddle, a local kid who played with a lightness and a swing that was more Buddy Rich than John Bonham. They had the personnel, they had the songs pouring out of Toy Caldwell like water from a broken dam. They had the hunger of men who had worked in the mills and survived the war and knew they didn't want to die doing anything else. But they didn't have a name, and they didn't have a deal. They were rehearsing in a dusty, dimly lit warehouse space on the outskirts of town. It smelled of stale oil and old wood. They practiced for hours, sweating through their shirts, locking in that groove. Tommy and Paul Riddle were figuring out a rhythm section language that would define the next decade of their lives, a gallop, a swing, a heartbeat. One evening, after a long session, they were sitting around, exhausted, trying to figure out what to call themselves. The toy factory sounded childish now. They needed something that sounded like the music, old, weird, dignified, and distinctly Southern. Someone noticed a key ring hanging on the wall. It had a small tag on it, left by the previous tenant of the warehouse. The name on the tag was simple, two names indistinguishable from a lawman or a preacher or a blues legend. Marshall Tucker. They laughed. They rolled it around on their tongues. The Marshall Tucker Band. It sounded right. It sounded like it had always existed. They didn't know Marshall Tucker was a blind piano tuner living just a few miles away. They didn't know they were stealing a man's name to conquer the world. They just knew it fit. Tommy Caldwell picked up his bass, nodded at his brother, and counted them in. The name was set. The lineup was locked. The rehearsal was over. The real work, the climb up the mountain, the miles of highway, the glory and the tragedy was about to begin. A name is just a word until you fill it with noise. The Marshall Tucker Band was painted on the bass drum head, but in the early months of 1971, that name didn't mean anything to anyone outside of Spartanburg, South Carolina. They were just 6 guys in a rented warehouse, sweating through their shirts, trying to turn a collision of influences into a coherent sound. And it was a collision. That is the only word for it. Usually bands form because everyone likes the same records. You like the Beatles? I like the Beatles. Let's start a band. But the Marshall Tucker Band was built on a series of musical arguments that somehow resolved into a harmony. Toy Caldwell, fresh from the jungles of Vietnam, was playing the blues with a thumb-picking ferocity that sounded like a man trying to exorcise a ghost. Doug Gray, the singer, was channeling the soul shouters of the R&B circuit. Jerry Eubanks was trying to inject the airy, sophisticated breath of the flute into a genre defined by electric aggression. And holding this chaotic, swirling mess together was the younger brother. Tommy Caldwell wasn't interested in being the star. In those long, grueling rehearsal sessions that stretched late into the humid South Carolina nights, Tommy was the mechanic. He was under the hood of the engine, making sure the pistons fired in time. While Toy's guitar would wander off into long, improvised jams that could last for 10 minutes, Tommy had to make a decision. He could have played simple root notes, just thumping along on the beat like a metronome. That's what most rock bassists did in 1971. It was safe, it was easy. But Tommy didn't play safe. He played the bass like a lead instrument that had taken a vow of silence. He filled the spaces Toy left behind. He played with a melodic sensibility that he had picked up from those late-night jazz broadcasts. He wasn't just keeping time. He was having a conversation with his brother's guitar. Speaking a language only the two of them understood. They were working men. That's an important distinction. They weren't art school dropouts living on trust funds. They had jobs. They had families. They were scraping by. The rehearsal warehouse wasn't a hobby. It was a desperate gamble. They were investing their time, their sweat, and their scant money into the belief that this noise they were making was worth something. But Spartanburg was a small pond. To make it, they had to swim downstream. They had to get to the ocean. And in 1971, the ocean of Southern rock was located in one specific place, Macon, Georgia. Macon was the Vatican. It was the home of Capricorn Records, the label founded by Phil Walden. Walden was the visionary who had managed Otis Redding. He was the man who had discovered the Allman Brothers Band. He was the gatekeeper. If you wanted the world to hear you, you had to get Phil Walden to nod his head. The connection came through another band. Wet Willie, a group from Mobile, Alabama, who had already been signed to Capricorn, came through Spartanburg to play a show at a club called The Sitar. The Marshall Tucker Band opened for them. It's a classic rock and roll cliche. The opening band blows the headliner away. That didn't exactly happen. Wet Willie was a powerhouse, but the opening band certainly woke them up. Jimmy Hall, the singer of Wet Willie, watched from the side of the stage. He saw Toy's thumb flying. He heard Doug's voice, and he felt the floor shaking from the rhythm section of Paul Riddle and Tommy Caldwell. He went back to Macon and told Phil Walden, "You need to hear these guys. They're different." Walden was skeptical. Everyone had a great band they wanted him to hear, but he agreed to listen. He sent a producer named Paul Hornsby up to Spartanburg to scout them. Hornsby walked into that smelly, dimly lit warehouse. He saw the flute. He saw the cowboy hats. He saw the thumb picking. It was a bizarre visual. But then they started to play Take the Highway. Hornsby didn't just hear a band. He heard a hit. He heard a sound that was polished, professional, and entirely unique. He went back to Macon and told Walden, "Sign them, now." The contract was signed. The toy factory was officially dead. The Marshall Tucker Band was born as a professional entity. In 1973, the band packed their gear and drove south to Macon to record their debut album. Entering Capricorn Studios was like entering a cathedral. This was the room where Duane Allman had laid down his slide guitar tracks. The ghosts of the greats were in the walls. For Tommy Caldwell, this was the moment of truth. The studio is a cruel mirror. On stage, you can hide mistakes with volume and energy. In the studio, under the microscope of the microphone, every flaw is magnified. If you rush the beat, the tape hears it. If you drag, the tape hears it. Tommy walked into that studio with a Fender Precision bass and a determination that bordered on obsession. He knew that the sound of this album would define the rest of his life. The producer, Paul Hornsby, made a brilliant decision. He realized that the magic of the Marshall Tucker Band wasn't in their overdubs. It was in their interplay. They were a live band. They breathed together. So he set them up to record largely live, capturing the energy of 6 men in a room. The sessions were intense, fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and the terrifying thrill of opportunity, they laid down track after track. Hillbilly Band, a romping, stomping declaration of identity. Ab's Song, a gentle acoustic ballad that showed Toy's sensitive side. But there were two songs recorded in those sessions that would become the pillars of their career, and both of them showcased the genius of Tommy Caldwell. The first was Take the Highway. It opens with a flute solo, a daring move for a rock band. But listen to what happens when the band kicks in. It's a gallop. It's a triplet feel, a rhythm that feels like a horse running at full speed. That drive comes from the drums, yes, but the weight comes from Tommy. He is locking down a complex, shifting time signature with a grace that makes it feel effortless. He is navigating the twists and turns of the song structure like a driver who knows every curve of the road. And then there was Can't You See? Can't You See is Toy Caldwell's masterpiece. It is a song about heartbreak, about a man so desperate to escape his pain that he's waiting for a freight train to take him away. It is the quintessential Southern rock anthem. But pay attention to how it starts. It doesn't start with a guitar riff. It doesn't start with a drum fill. It doesn't start with Doug Gray's voice. It starts with Tommy. It starts with a bass line, 3 notes, dum, 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 a pause, then again. It is a heartbeat. It is the sound of walking alone on a railroad track. That intro is one of the most famous openings in rock history. And it was Tommy's moment. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't playing a million notes. He was setting the mood. He was creating the landscape for his brother to step into. When the flute enters, and then the guitar, and finally the vocals, they are all resting on the platform Tommy built in those first few seconds. The recording of Can't You See was magic. It was one of those moments where the air in the room changes. They knew they had captured lightning. Doug Gray's vocal performance was raw and tearing. Toy's guitar solo was a lyrical cry of pain. But that bass line was the hook that would drag listeners in for the next 50 years. When the album was finished, they had to decide on a cover. In 1973, rock stars were starting to look like aliens. David Bowie was Ziggy Stardust. Elton John was wearing feathers. The Rolling Stones were looking like dissolute aristocrats. The Marshall Tucker Band chose a different path. They put 2 old men on the cover of their debut. No band photos, no names, just an evocative image of the rural South. It was a statement. It said, "We are not the story. The music is the story. This land is the story." The album, titled simply The Marshall Tucker Band, was released in early 1973. It was a critical success, but records don't sell themselves. To move units, you had to tour. And Capricorn Records had the perfect vehicle to launch their new investment. They put the Marshall Tucker Band on the road as the opening act for the biggest band in America, the Allman Brothers. This was not a gift. It was a test. You have to understand the dynamic of an Allman Brothers crowd in 1973. These were the faithful. They were there to see Greg Allman and Dickie Betts. They were there for the extended jams of Whipping Post. They didn't care about the opening act. Opening acts were usually tolerated, ignored, or if they were bad, booed off the stage. For a group of boys from Spartanburg who had spent years playing VFW halls, walking out onto the stage of an arena in front of 20,000 stoned, impatient Allman Brothers fans was terrifying. The first few shows were a baptism by fire. The band would walk out, and the roar of the crowd was deafening. But it wasn't a roar for them. It was a roar of anticipation for the headliners. Toy Caldwell would step up to the microphone, mumble a quick hello, and count off the first song. And this is where the brotherhood was tested. If they had been a group of hired guns, they might have crumbled, but they were a unit. They looked at each other. Toy looked at Tommy, Tommy looked at Paul, and they locked in. They learned very quickly that they couldn't win the crowd with theatrics. They couldn't outcool the Allman Brothers. They had to outplay them, or at least play so well that the crowd had no choice but to listen. Tommy Caldwell was the anchor in this storm. On those massive stages, the sound can get lost. The drums can echo. The guitar can disappear into the rafters. The bass is the only thing that physically hits the audience in the chest. Tommy played with a ferocity during that tour that became legendary. He stood his ground next to the drum riser, legs apart, head down, digging into the strings. He was driving the band forward, pushing the tempo, demanding attention. Slowly, song by song, city by city, the mood changed. The crowd stopped talking. They started listening to the flute. They started cheering for the thumb-picking guitar. And by the time the band hit the opening notes of Can't You See, with Tommy's bass rumbling through the PA system like an approaching thunderstorm, the lighters were up. They weren't getting booed. They were getting encores. The tour with the Allman Brothers changed everything. They went from being local heroes to national contenders, but the transition came with a price. They were no longer sleeping in their own beds. They were living in a van and later a bus. They were eating bad food at truck stops. They were drinking too much because there was nothing else to do after the show in a dry county in the middle of nowhere. For Tommy, the adjustment was particularly strange. He was a homebody at heart. He loved Spartanburg. He loved his family. He wasn't chasing the rock star lifestyle of groupies and excess. He wanted to play the music and go home, but the machine of the music industry had caught them. The demand was insatiable. Can't You See was climbing the charts. Radio stations were playing Take the Highway. Capricorn Records was demanding more dates, more cities, more exposure. The brotherhood of the band, which had been forged in the easygoing days of the garage, was now being hardened into something else. They were a corporation now. They were employers. They had a road crew, managers, agents. The weight of responsibility was growing, and the dynamic between the brothers began to shift under the pressure. Toy was the star. He wrote the songs. He played the solos. The spotlight was always on him. Tommy was the shadow. In many bands, this leads to jealousy. The bass player wants to write songs. The bass player wants to sing lead. But Tommy Caldwell was different. He didn't want Toy's spotlight. He wanted Toy's safety. He saw the toll the road was taking on his older brother. Toy was a sensitive soul carrying the trauma of Vietnam and the pressure of being the new guitar god. He medicated his anxiety with alcohol and whatever else was available. Tommy took it upon himself to be the guardian. He became the one who checked the set lists. He became the one who made sure Toy made it to the bus. He became the one who handled the business when the others were too tired or too intoxicated to care. He was the backbone of the music, yes, but he was becoming the backbone of the organization. By the end of 1973, the Marshall Tucker Band had played hundreds of shows. They were exhausted, battered, and triumphant. Their debut album was gold. They were famous. They returned to Spartanburg as conquering heroes. But when Tommy walked back into his house, put down his bass case, and looked in the mirror, he saw the change. The baby fat was gone. The eyes were harder. The innocence of the rehearsal warehouse was gone forever. They had built the machine. It was powerful. It was loud. It was making them rich. But a machine needs fuel, and a machine needs maintenance. And if you run it too hard, for too long, without checking the bolts, things start to rattle. They didn't know it yet, but the golden age had begun. The next few years would be a blur of platinum records, private jets, and arena tours. They would define the sound of the South for a generation, but the seeds of the end were already being sown. The pace was unsustainable, the lifestyle was toxic, and the reliance on the backbone, on the quiet strength of Tommy Caldwell, was becoming absolute. As 1974 dawned, the Marshall Tucker Band wasn't just a band anymore, they were a juggernaut. And Tommy Caldwell was the man steering them onto the highway, putting his foot on the gas and heading straight into the blinding sun. There's a specific moment in the life of a successful rock band when gravity seems to stop working. The laws of physics that govern normal lives, the need for sleep, the constraints of money, the limitations of geography, simply evaporate. You enter the slipstream. For the Marshall Tucker Band, that moment arrived in 1974. They were no longer the scrappy openers fighting for attention in the shadow of the Allman Brothers. They were headliners. They were a corporation. They were the new kings of the South. If the first album was the introduction, the next 3 years were the coronation. From 1974 to 1977, the band went on a creative and commercial run that remains almost unparalleled in the history of the genre. They released A New Life, Where We All Belong, Searchin' for a Rainbow, and Carolina Dreams in rapid succession. 4 albums in 4 years, all gold, all platinum. But to understand the magnitude of this success and the terrible weight it placed on the shoulders of Tommy Caldwell, you have to look beyond the sales figures. You have to look at the culture they were conquering. America in the mid-1970s was a fractured place. The idealism of the 60s was dead, buried under the rubble of Watergate and Vietnam. The country was tired. It was cynical. It was looking for something authentic, something that felt like home. And here came 6 guys from Spartanburg, South Carolina, who didn't look like rock stars. They looked like the guys who fixed your car. They looked like the guys who baled your hay. They didn't wear makeup. They didn't smash their instruments. They just stood there and played with a level of undeniable virtuosic honesty. They became the bridge. At a Marshall Tucker concert in 1975, you would see a sight that existed almost nowhere else in America. Long-haired hippies dancing next to rednecks in trucker hats. The counterculture and the cowboy culture united by the groove of Tommy Caldwell's bass. The engine of this success was the songwriting of Toy Caldwell. He was pouring out songs at a frightening pace, but a song is just a skeleton until the band puts flesh on it, and Tommy Caldwell was the one building the muscle. Let's talk about the album A New Life, released in 1974. The cover features the band standing in a field looking relaxed, almost pastoral, but the music inside was becoming more complex, more ambitious. The title track, A New Life, is a perfect example of Tommy's evolving role. It's a bluesy, soulful ballad. Listen to the bass line. He isn't just following the chord changes. He's sliding. He's using the upper register of the neck. He's playing counter melodies that weave in and out of Jerry Eubanks's saxophone lines. Tommy had developed a style that was deceptively simple. He played with a heavy thumb, much like his brother, but he had a distinct thump that cut through the mix. In the chaotic sonic landscape of a 7-piece band, with 2 guitars, drums, percussion, flute, sax, and vocals, all fighting for space, the bass needs to be a sonic anchor. If it's too busy, the song falls apart. If it's too simple, the song loses its swing. Tommy walked that line perfectly. He was the diplomat of the low end, but his contribution went beyond the bass. He was becoming the band's quality control officer. In the studio, while the others might be distracted by the party atmosphere that permeated Capricorn Records, Tommy was often the one focused on the take. He had an ear for the pocket, that magical, undefinable space where the rhythm feels lazy and urgent at the same time. If Paul Riddle was rushing, Tommy would pull him back with a look. If Toy was dragging, Tommy would push him forward with a dig of his shoulder. He conducted the band not with a baton, but with his body language. By 1975, the van was gone. The bus was still there for the crew, but the band was flying. The Marshall Tucker Band had entered the era of excess. They were making millions of dollars. They were buying ranches, fast cars, and horses. They were living the Southern rock dream. But the road is a dangerous drug. It separates you from reality. You wake up in a different city every day. You don't know what day of the week it is. You don't know what the weather is outside the air-conditioned bubble of the hotel in the arena. Your only reality is the 2 hours you spend on stage. For Tommy Caldwell, the pressure was immense. He was the primary songwriter, the lead guitarist, and the reluctant star. The record label was constantly asking, "Where's the next hit, Toy? Where's the next Can't You See?" Toy dealt with the pressure the way many men of his generation and background did. He medicated it. The alcohol consumption was legendary. The drugs were available in unlimited quantities. This is where Tommy's role shifted from musical backbone to emotional guardian. Tommy was the younger brother, but he became the protector. He watched Toy like a hawk. He knew Toy's limits better than Toy did. There are stories from the road crew of Tommy quietly intervening when things got too out of hand, of him steering his brother away from the worst of the hangers-on, of him making sure Toy was fed and rested. It wasn't a burden he complained about. It was the code. You look out for your kin. But who looked out for Tommy? He was the responsible one, the steady hand. But he was living the same life, drinking the same whiskey, breathing the same exhaust fumes. He was just better at hiding the toll it was taking. He channeled his stress into the performance. He played harder. He sang louder. In 1975, they released Searchin' for a Rainbow. And on that album was a song that would become their second anthem, Fire on the Mountain. The song was written by George McCorkle, the rhythm guitarist, who usually stayed in the background. It was a story song, a tale of the gold rush, of a family leaving the Carolinas to seek their fortune in the West, only to find misery and death. It was a tragic, cinematic cowboy movie in 3 verses. It was the perfect metaphor for the band's own journey. They had left Carolina to seek gold, and they found it, but the fire was burning hot. Tommy's contribution to this track is vital. Listen to the chorus. Fire on the mountain, lightning in the air, gold in them hills, and it's waiting for me there. That high, lonesome harmony, that's Tommy. His voice wasn't a lead instrument like Doug Gray's. It was a texture. It had a rough, reedy quality that blended perfectly with Doug's soaring tenor and Toy's gruff baritone. It gave the chorus a sense of desperation, a sense of family. When the 3 of them sang together, it sounded like a choir of ghosts. Fire on the Mountain was a massive hit. It cemented their status not just as a Southern band, but as an American institution. They were playing stadiums now. They were sharing bills with the Eagles, with the Rolling Stones, with the Grateful Dead, and they were blowing them off the stage. There is a famous bootleg recording from a show in Englishtown, New Jersey in 1977, played to over 100,000 people. The Grateful Dead were headlining. But when Marshall Tucker played, the energy was ferocious. Tommy Caldwell is a beast on that recording. His bass is driving the band like a runaway train. You can hear the hunger in his playing. He wasn't intimidated by the size of the crowd. He was energized by it. He was proving note by note that a bunch of Milltown boys belonged on the biggest stage in the world. The year of the bicentennial. America was celebrating its 200th birthday. And for the first time since the Civil War, the South was cool. Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer from Georgia, was running for president. He was a fan of rock music. He famously said that the Allman Brothers helped him get into the White House. But the Marshall Tucker Band was part of that wave too. They played benefits for him. They were ambassadors of the New South, progressive, integrated, creative, and proud. Tommy Caldwell, the quiet bassist from Spartanburg, found himself shaking hands with future presidents. He was walking the halls of power. It must have been surreal. Just 5 years earlier, he was wondering if he'd spend the rest of his life working in a textile mill. Now, he was cultural royalty. But amidst the politics and the parties, the band went back into the studio to record what would become their commercial apex, Carolina Dreams. If you own one Marshall Tucker album, it's probably this one. It is a polished, perfect diamond of a record, and it contains the song that changed everything. Heard It in a Love Song. It is perhaps the perfect pop country rock song. It has a melody that you can hum after hearing it once. It has a flute hook that is instantly recognizable. And it has lyrics that resonated with millions of lonely, restless Americans. I ain't never seen anything that I wanted to do more than I wanted to be with you, but I can't stay here. It's a song about leaving. It's a song about a man who loves a woman but loves the road more. It's a song about the inability to settle down. Toy wrote it, but Tommy lived it. They all did. Ironically, this song about leaving made them so famous that they could never really go home again. It crossed over. It wasn't just on rock radio, it was on pop radio, sandwiched between ABBA and the Bee Gees. It was on country radio. It was everywhere. For the first time, grandmothers knew who the Marshall Tucker Band was. The success of Heard It in a Love Song pushed the band into the stratosphere. The tours got longer, the venues got bigger, the money got crazier, but success is a centrifuge. It spins you faster and faster, pushing everything to the edges, trying to separate the solid parts from the liquid. Tommy Caldwell was the solid part, while the rest of the band bought flashy cars or moved to bigger cities. Tommy stayed rooted. He bought a farm in Spartanburg. He invested in land. He wanted something real, something he could touch. He married. He had a daughter. He was trying to build a life that existed outside the tour bus. He was trying to be a normal man in an abnormal world. He was the one who would fly home immediately after the last show of a tour, desperate to sleep in his own bed, to wake up and feed his horses. He used the land to ground himself, to wash off the grime of the road. But the road always called them back. The machine was hungry. By 1978, the cracks were starting to become visible to those who knew where to look. The albums released after Carolina Dreams, records like Together Forever, were still good, but they lacked the manic, hungry fire of the early days. The songwriting was becoming a little more formulaic. The jams were becoming a little more predictable. It wasn't that they were losing their talent, they were losing their exhaustion battle. They were tired, bone tired. Toy Caldwell was suffering from writer's block. The well was running dry. The pressure to top Heard It in a Love Song was paralyzing, and the physical toll was mounting. You can see it in the photos from this era. They look bloated. Their eyes are puffy. The smiles don't reach their eyes. They are aging in dog years. 1 year on the road equals 7 years of normal life. Tommy was fighting to keep the morale up. He was the cheerleader. In interviews from this time, he is always the one talking about the future, about the next album, about how much they love playing together. He was trying to manifest the brotherhood that was slowly eroding under the friction of fame. He knew that if he stopped believing, the whole thing would collapse. As the decade drew to a close, the musical landscape shifted violently beneath their feet. Disco was king. Punk was exploding. New wave was arriving. The long-haired, jamming Southern rock bands were starting to look like dinosaurs. Leonard Skynyrd was gone. Their plane crashed in a Mississippi swamp in 1977. a tragedy that cast a long, dark shadow over every band in the genre. The Allman Brothers had broken up and reformed and were struggling. The Marshall Tucker Band was the last giant standing. They were the survivors. But survival is not the same as living. They were fighting a war on two fronts, a changing culture that deemed them obsolete and their own internal exhaustion. They went into the studio to record their 10th album, simply titled 10th. It was a workman-like effort. They were trying to adapt, trying to polish their sound for a new decade. Tommy Caldwell played on that record with the same professionalism he brought to everything. But if you listen closely to the bass lines on 10th, there is a heaviness there. It's the sound of a man carrying a load that has grown too heavy. He was 30 years old. He had accomplished more in a decade than most men do in a lifetime. He was wealthy. He was famous. He was respected. But he was tired. By the spring of 1980, the album 10th was finished. The band was preparing for another grueling summer tour, but Tommy was looking forward to the break. He wanted to be on his farm, to just be Tommy Caldwell from Spartanburg. He didn't know that the metronome had already started its final countdown. There is a specific quality to a Tuesday morning. It is the most ordinary time of the week. Monday's dread has passed. The anticipation of the weekend hasn't yet arrived. It is a time for commerce, for routine, for the quiet, invisible mechanics of daily life. On Tuesday, April 22, 1980, the sky over Spartanburg was a pale, indifferent blue. It was the kind of day that vanishes from memory almost as soon as it happens. For the thousands of people working in the textile mills or opening their shops on Main Street, it was just another day to earn a wage. For Tommy Caldwell, it was a day of leisure, a day to breathe. He was 30 years old. He was a millionaire rock star. He was a husband and a father. He had just finished recording his 10th album. By all accounts, he should have been celebrating. He should have been sleeping in. But the habits of the working class die hard. Tommy was up. He was active. He climbed into his 1975 Toyota Land Cruiser, a rugged utilitarian machine that represented his connection to the land, a stark contrast to the tour buses he spent his life in. He drove into the city center of Spartanburg. He had errands to run. Maybe he was going to the hardware store. Maybe he was going to the bank. The banality of his destination is the most heartbreaking part of the story. He wasn't driving to a drug deal. He wasn't racing a rival to the next gig. He was just living. The intersection of Church Street and Broad Street in downtown Spartanburg is not a dangerous place. It is wide. It is well lit. It is the heart of the city. At approximately 11 a.m., the physics of the universe conspired against Tommy Caldwell. The details of the accident have been retold in whispers for 40 years, often clouded by the fog of grief. But the police report tells a stark, simple story. Tommy was driving near the YMCA. Up ahead, parked on the side of the road, was a 1965 Ford Galaxy. It was a big, heavy American sedan, steel from bumper to bumper. Reports suggest the Ford was parked slightly askew, perhaps protruding just a few inches too far into the lane. Or perhaps Tommy, lost in thought, thinking about the farm, thinking about the upcoming tour, thinking about his brother, drifted just a fraction to the right. It takes less than a second to end a life. The Land Cruiser clipped the parked Ford. If he had been in a low-slung sports car, he might have just crumpled the fender. If he had been in a modern car with crumple zones, he might have walked away with a case of whiplash. But the Land Cruiser was a tall, rigid box. When the front wheel caught the immovable steel of the Ford, physics took over. The Jeep didn't just stop. It vaulted. It flipped. The violence of a car crash is quieted almost immediately by the shock of the aftermath. One moment, there is the roar of the engine and the tearing of metal. The next, there is just the hissing of a radiator and the settling of dust. Passers-by froze. Shopkeepers ran out to the sidewalk. In a small town like Spartanburg, everyone knows everyone. But in the twisted wreckage of the Land Cruiser, it was hard to recognize the man who had helped put their town on the map. Tommy had been thrown or crushed. The specific mechanics of his injuries were catastrophic. The human body, no matter how strong, no matter how much endurance it has built up over a decade of touring, is frail against 2 tons of rolling steel. He suffered massive head trauma. His body was broken. The ambulance sirens began to wail. That sound, the rising and falling scream, pierced the Tuesday morning calm. It is a sound that signals the end of normalcy. They rushed him to Spartanburg General Hospital. As the paramedics worked on him, cutting away his clothes, stabilizing his neck, they likely didn't know they were working on a legend. They just saw a young man in jeans, bleeding, broken, fighting for every ragged breath. News traveled differently in 1980. There was no Twitter, no instant notifications. The news of the crash moved through the phone lines of Spartanburg like a slow-moving virus. First, the call to his wife, the call that every spouse dreads. The police officer's voice, professional but heavy. "Ma'am, there's been an accident." Then the call to the band. Imagine the moment the phone rang in Tommy Caldwell's house. Toy, the older brother. Toy, the protector. Toy, who had survived Vietnam, who had survived the road, who had relied on Tommy to be the solid earth beneath his feet. To hear that Tommy, steady, reliable, safe Tommy, was lying on a gurney in the emergency room, it must have sounded like a joke, a cruel, impossible mistake. Tommy doesn't crash. Tommy drives the bus. Tommy fixes things. Toy rushed to the hospital. Doug Gray rushed to the hospital. George, Paul, Jerry, the brotherhood converged on the waiting room of Spartanburg General. When they arrived, the doctors gave them the news. It was grim, critical condition, massive brain injury. He was in a coma. And so began the vigil. There is a specific kind of hell known as the intensive care waiting room. It is a place where time ceases to exist. There is no day or night. There is only the rhythm of the monitors and the swinging of the double doors. For 6 days, the Marshall Tucker Band lived in this purgatory. They were men of action. They were used to solving problems. If an amp broke, you fixed it. If a truck broke down, you called a mechanic. If a crowd was hostile, you played harder. But you cannot fix a broken brain with a guitar solo. You cannot charm a coma. Toy Caldwell spent those days staring into the abyss. He and Tommy weren't just brothers. They were 2 halves of a whole. They had shared a room as boys. They had learned to play their instruments by watching each other's hands. They had developed a telepathic musical language. Toy was the fire, yes, but fire needs oxygen. Tommy was the oxygen. Friends who were there described Toy as a man disintegrating. He paced, he prayed, he cursed, he bargained with God. Take the hits back, take the gold records, take the money. Just give me my brother. The news leaked out to the wider world. Fans began to gather outside the hospital. Radio stations in the South broke their formats to give updates. "Pray for Tommy," the DJ said. "The backbone is fighting." In the hospital room, Tommy lay silent. The machines breathed for him. The hands that had plucked the bass line to "Can't You See?" The hands that had held the rhythm for a decade of American music were still. What does a man dream of in a coma? Does he hear the roar of the crowd at Madison Square Garden? Does he hear the whistle of the train in the distance? Does he hear the sound of the wind moving through the grass on his farm? Or does he hear the music? We like to think he heard the music. We like to think that in those final silent days, Tommy Caldwell was playing the gig of his life in his own mind, locking in with the groove, holding it down, keeping it steady. But outside the dream, the medical reality was brutal. The brain swelling was severe. The damage was catastrophic. The doctors did everything they could. They were fighting for him. But medicine, for all its miracles, has limits. It stops at the precipice of the soul. On Monday, April 28, 1980, 6 days after the crash, the doctors called the family together. The fight was over. The swelling was insurmountable. The brain activity was gone. The decision was made. The machines would be turned off. April 28, 1980. It wasn't a plane crash in a swamp. It wasn't a drug overdose in a hotel room. It wasn't a suicide. It was a quiet passing in a hospital room in the town where he was born. When Tommy Caldwell's heart beat for the final time, a silence descended on Spartanburg that was heavier than any silence that had come before. Toy Caldwell had to walk out of that room. He had to walk out into a world that no longer contained his brother. He had to walk out as a solo act in life. The news broke instantly. It rippled out from Spartanburg across the South and into the world. Tommy Caldwell is dead. For the fans, it was a punch to the gut. They had just lost Bon Scott of AC/DC in February. They were still mourning Skynyrd. And now, the good guys, the safe band, the survivors, they had been touched by death too. It felt unfair. It felt random. It felt like a violation of the deal. We give you our adoration, and you give us the music forever. That's the deal. But the deal was broken. The funeral was a massive, sorrowful affair. Spartanburg shut down. The Southern rock royalty descended on the town. Charlie Daniels, members of the Allman Brothers, the Outlaws, and the poets of the genre. They came to pay respects not just to a musician, but to a man. Because everyone knew the truth. Tommy was the good one. He was the one who didn't have an enemy in the world. He was the one who remembered your name. He was the one who helped you load your gear. They buried him in the red clay of South Carolina, the same earth he had tried so hard to stay connected to. But as the dirt hit the casket, the members of the Marshall Tucker Band were left with a terrifying question, a question that echoed in the silence of the graveyard. What now? Grief is a ghost. It haunts the empty spaces. When a family member dies, you can close the door to their room. You can put their photos in a drawer. You can try, slowly and painfully, to rearrange the furniture of your life to fill the void. But a rock and roll band cannot close the door. Their grief is public. Their loss is contractually obligated to appear on stage at 8 p.m., rain or shine. In May of 1980, the Marshall Tucker Band faced an existential crisis that few people outside the music industry can truly understand. They had just buried their brother, Tommy Caldwell. The earth on his grave in Spartanburg was still fresh. The shock of the car crash was still vibrating in their bones, but the machine, the massive, grinding, relentless machinery of the music business, does not know how to mourn. It only knows how to move forward. They had a new album, 10th, sitting in the warehouses, ready to ship. They had a summer tour booked, dozens of dates, contracts signed, promoters waiting, tickets sold. They had a crew of 30 people whose mortgages depended on the band getting back on the bus. And so, in the shadow of the tragedy, the surviving members gathered in a room to ask the impossible question: do we stop or do we play? Toy Caldwell, the grieving brother, was the deciding vote. He was shattered. He was a man walking through a fog, but he was also a Caldwell. And the Caldwells were raised with a blue-collar work ethic that bordered on the religious. You finish the job. You honor your commitments. And there was another softer logic at work. They told themselves, as the survivors of tragedies often do, Tommy would have wanted us to keep playing. It was a comforting thought. It was a shield against the guilt. But deep down, in the quiet corners of their minds, they must have wondered if the music could survive without its heartbeat. If the band was going to survive, they needed a bass player. They didn't hold a massive publicized audition. They didn't fly in session pros from Los Angeles or New York. That would have felt like a betrayal. They needed someone who spoke the language of Spartanburg. They turned to Franklin Wilkie. Franklin was the perfect choice. On paper, he wasn't a stranger. He was an old friend. He had played in the early garage bands with Toy and Tommy back in the 60s. He had been part of the Toy Factory in its infancy. He knew the songs. He knew the guys. He knew the history. He was a Spartanburg boy. But being a friend and filling the shoes of a legend are two very different things. When Franklin Wilkie plugged in his bass for that first rehearsal, the air in the room must have been suffocating. He was stepping into a role that was sacred. He wasn't just replacing a musician, he was replacing a brother. And musically, there was a difference. It was subtle, but to the ears of Tommy Caldwell and Paul Riddle, it must have sounded like a siren. Tommy played with his thumb, a heavy thumping percussive style that locked in with Toy's own thumb-picking guitar technique. It was a genetic rhythm, a biological syncopation. Franklin played with his fingers. He was a more traditional player, competent, solid, professional. But the swing was different. The Marshall Tucker Band sound was built on a very specific kind of pocket, a jazz-inflected, swinging groove that allowed the band to float. With Franklin, the sound became straighter. It became more rock. The ethereal floating quality that Tommy provided, the ability to be heavy and light at the same time, was gone. They were still a great band, but they were a different band. The 1980 tour was a macabre victory lap. Every night they walked onto the stage, and every night the absence of Tommy Caldwell was the loudest thing in the arena. For Tommy Caldwell, these shows were a form of exquisite torture. For 10 years, Toy had stood on stage right. When he looked to his left, he saw Tommy. He saw the cowboy hat. He saw the intense focus. He saw his own blood. Now, when he looked to his left, he saw Franklin, or he saw an empty space. The phantom limb syndrome is a medical phenomenon where an amputee can still feel pain in the limb that has been removed. The Marshall Tucker Band was suffering from a collective phantom limb. Toy would launch into the solo for Take the Highway, and his body would instinctively lean toward where Tommy should be. He would wait for that specific push, that specific accent that Tommy would hit on the bass drum, and it wouldn't be there. He was playing with ghosts. The fans were loyal. They showed up in droves to support the band. They held up signs, "We miss you, Tommy." They cheered louder for Toy, trying to wrap him in a blanket of affection. But you cannot cheer away grief. Backstage, the atmosphere had changed. The raucous frat house energy of the 70s was gone. The dressing rooms were quieter. The drinking was no longer celebratory. It was medicinal. Toy began to withdraw further into himself. He became harder to reach. The wall between him and the rest of the world, which Tommy had helped to dismantle, was being rebuilt brick by brick. In 1981, the band released their first album without Tommy. They titled it Dedicated. It was a noble effort. The songs were decent. Doug Gray sang his heart out. Toy played with a mournful, bluesy intensity. They were trying so hard to prove that they were still the Marshall Tucker Band. But the reviews were polite, distant. The critics treated the album like a eulogy, not a continuation. And the sales reflected the harsh reality. Dedicated didn't go gold. It didn't produce a smash hit like Heard It in a Love Song. It charted, then it faded. The magic dust, that indefinable sparkle that turns a good song into a hit, had vanished. Part of this was the loss of Tommy, but part of it was the tsunami of cultural change that was sweeping across America. 1981 was the year MTV launched. Video killed the radio star, but it massacred the Southern rock star. MTV was a visual medium. It demanded glamour. It demanded youth. It demanded spandex, hairspray, synthesizers, and theatricality. It wanted Duran Duran on a yacht. It wanted Prince in a bathtub. It wanted Van Halen jumping off drum risers. It did not want 6 hairy, overweight, middle-aged men from South Carolina standing still and playing flutes. The Marshall Tucker Band, visually and sonically, was an antique. They looked like artifacts from a bygone era. They were analog men in a digital world. Capricorn Records, their longtime home and champion, had gone bankrupt in late 1979. They were now on Warner Brothers, a massive corporate label that didn't understand them, didn't nurture them, and frankly didn't know what to do with them. The band was fighting a war on 2 fronts, the internal war against grief and the external war against irrelevance. The decline wasn't a cliff, it was a slow, painful slide. By 1982 and 1983, the venues were getting smaller. They weren't selling out Madison Square Garden anymore. They were playing theme parks. They were playing state fairs. For a band that had flown on private jets just 3 years earlier, this was a humiliation. And the pressure on Tommy Caldwell was becoming unsustainable. He was suffering from severe writer's block. Without Tommy there to encourage him, to filter the world for him, to be a sounding board, Toy couldn't find the songs. The creative marriage of the band had been a triangle: Toy's writing, Doug's voice, and Tommy's arrangement chalk leadership. With one point of the triangle gone, the structure collapsed. Paul Riddle, the drummer, was the first of the original members to break. Paul was a virtuoso drummer, a jazz player at heart, but the grind of the road combined with the sadness that permeated the band was too much. He was exhausted. He wanted to preserve his health and his family. In 1983, he quietly stepped away. That was the second blow. Now the rhythm section, the engine of the band, was completely gone. Tommy dead, Paul retired. The band that was on stage now was a ship of Theseus. If you replace the planks one by one, is it still the same ship? If you replace the bass, then the drums, is it still the Marshall Tucker Band? The end of the original era didn't come with a bang. It came with a sigh. By late 1983, Tommy Caldwell had had enough. He was the primary songwriter. He was the lead guitarist. He was the face of the band's musical identity. But without Tommy, the joy had completely evaporated. Every time he got on the bus, he missed his brother. Every time he played Can't You See, he missed his brother. Every time he looked at a contract or dealt with a record label executive, he missed his brother. He was carrying the weight of the legacy alone, and it was crushing him. He looked at the changing musical landscape, the synthesizers, the drum machines, the hair metal bands, and he realized he didn't belong there. He was a cowboy in a sci-fi movie. He made the decision to walk away. It is hard to overstate how shocking this was. Tommy Caldwell was the Marshall Tucker Band. He wrote the songs, he defined the sound. For him to quit was like Mick Jagger quitting the Stones or Pete Townshend quitting the Who. But Tommy wasn't quitting for a solo career. He wasn't quitting to join a supergroup. He was quitting to go home. He was quitting to go back to Spartanburg, to the land, to the silence. He wanted to heal. George McCorkle, the rhythm guitarist who wrote Fire on the Mountain, followed suit. He saw the writing on the wall. If Tommy was leaving, the band was over. By 1984, the exodus was complete. Tommy Caldwell, George McCorkle, and Paul Riddle were gone. Tommy Caldwell was dead. Only Doug Gray and Jerry Eubanks remained from the original 6. In a move that would define the band's future and complicate its legacy, the departing members agreed to let Doug Gray keep the name. They signed over the rights to the Marshall Tucker Band. It made business sense. The name was a brand. It had value. It could still sell tickets at state fairs and motorcycle rallies. Doug Gray wanted to keep working. He wanted to keep the bus on the road. But in doing so, they created a schism in reality. There was the Marshall Tucker Band, the entity that toured, played the hits, and kept the logo alive. And then there was the actual band, the Brotherhood of Spartanburg Boys, who had created that magic in the 70s. That band was dead. It had died in pieces, starting on April 22, 1980, and finishing in a lawyer's office in 1984. Tommy Caldwell returned to Spartanburg. He played locally. He formed a small blues band. He released a solo album years later, but he never regained the fire of the 1970s. The light had gone out of his eyes. He lived for another 9 years after leaving the band. He died in 1993 at the age of 45 from heart failure, likely exacerbated by the years of hard living and the heavy, silent burden of grief he carried for his brother. The aftershock was a long, slow fade. The tragedy of the Marshall Tucker Band isn't just that Tommy died. It's that his death triggered a slow-motion collapse that took down one of the greatest creative units in American history. It proved definitively that a band is not a brand. A band is a chemical reaction. It is a specific combination of elements: Toy's thumb, Doug's voice, Jerry's flute, Paul's swing, George's rhythm, and Tommy's backbone. When you remove the backbone, the body might twitch for a while, it might even walk a few steps, but it cannot run, it cannot fly. The 1980s marched on, the world changed, the South changed, the music changed. And back in Spartanburg, in a quiet cemetery, the man who held it all together lay at rest while the band he built continued to drift down the highway, a ghost ship sailing under a famous flag, searching for a harbor that no longer existed. They say time heals all wounds. It is a lie we tell ourselves to make the passage of years bearable. Time does not heal. It merely leaves scar tissue. It covers the raw nerve. It dulls the sharpest edge of the pain, but the injury remains. For 13 years after the death of Tommy Caldwell, his older brother Toy lived with a phantom limb. He walked, he talked, he played his guitar, he released a solo album, he played small clubs, he smiled for photos. But those who knew him, those who really looked into the eyes of the man who had written, "Can't you see?" saw the truth. The light had dimmed. The fire that had burned so brightly in the 1970s, fueled by the intuitive psychic connection with his brother, was flickering in the wind. Tommy Caldwell was a man who carried the weight of the ghosts. He carried Vietnam, he carried the road, but mostly he carried the silence of the bass notes that were no longer there. On February 25th, 1993, the other shoe finally dropped. Tommy Caldwell died in his sleep at his home in Moore, South Carolina. The official cause was heart failure. But in the mythology of Southern rock and in the hearts of those who loved him, it was understood as something else. It was a broken heart, finally giving up the ghost. He was 45 years old. With Toy's passing, the circle was tragically complete. The two brothers, the fire and the earth, the melody and the backbone, were reunited in the red clay of Spartanburg. But the story of Tommy Caldwell didn't end with his death, nor with his brothers. In fact, the story was just beginning its second life, a life lived in the echo. Legacy is a strange thing. It isn't always a statue in a town square. Sometimes legacy is a sound. Sometimes it is a chord progression played by a kid who wasn't even born when the original band broke up. If you turn on country radio today, or if you go to a Zac Brown Band concert or listen to Blackberry Smoke or Chris Stapleton, you are hearing the ghost of Tommy Caldwell. The Marshall Tucker Band, with Tommy anchoring the low end, invented a specific musical dialect. Before them, you had country and you had rock. The Marshall Tucker Band proved that you could be both. They proved you could have a flute in a country song. They proved you could jam like jazz musicians and still tell a story about a hillbilly. They proved that the Southern sound wasn't just three chords and the truth. It was complex, sophisticated, and deeply groovy. Tommy Caldwell's bass playing was the blueprint for modern country rock rhythm sections. He taught the world that a country bass line didn't have to be a boring Route 5 plod. It could swing, it could dance, it could be the lead instrument in the shadows. Every time a modern band extends a song into a jam session, every time a bassist adds a little jazz flourish to a truck driving anthem, they are paying a subconscious royalty to Tommy Caldwell. But what of the name? What of the Marshall Tucker Band? Here lies the most complicated part of the legacy. The band never stopped touring. Doug Gray, the lead singer with the soaring voice, kept the promise. He kept the bus on the road. For decades through the 90s, the 2000s, and into the present day, the Marshall Tucker Band has played fairs, festivals, and casinos across America. For some purists, this is a point of contention. They look at the stage and they see strangers. They don't see Toy. They don't see George. They don't see Paul. And they certainly don't see Tommy. They call it a tribute act, a ghost ship sailing under a stolen flag. But for others, for the fans who just want to hear the songs, for the people who want to close their eyes and be transported back to 1975, Doug Gray is a hero. He is the keeper of the flame. He is ensuring that the songs don't die in a vault. And perhaps both things are true. The ship of Theseus has had every plank replaced. It is not the same boat that left Spartanburg in 1972, but it carries the same cargo. It carries the songs. And every night when the current bass player steps up to play the opening notes of Can't You See, he is stepping into Tommy Caldwell's shoes. He is recreating a moment of inspiration that happened in a dusty warehouse 50 years ago. He is keeping the heartbeat alive, even if the heart itself has stopped. But beyond the music, the story of Tommy Caldwell stands as a profound and terrifying cautionary tale. It is a reminder of the exquisite fragility of life. We tend to think of rock stars as invincible. We think they are protected by their fame, by their money, by the adoration of the crowd. We think that if they die, it will be in a blaze of glory, a plane crash, an overdose, a dramatic exit. Tommy Caldwell teaches us that death is domestic. It is banal. It is a parked car on a Tuesday morning. He teaches us that you can survive the war, you can survive the tour, you can survive the demons of the industry, and you can still be taken out by a moment of bad luck on a city street. It is a lesson in humility. It reminds us that the backbone, the strong, silent, reliable force in our lives, is not unbreakable. We all have a Tommy Caldwell in our lives. Maybe it's a father, a brother, a quiet friend, the person who doesn't seek the spotlight, the person who drives the car, the person who makes sure the bills are paid, the person who holds the rhythm of the family together. We assume they will always be there. We assume the bass line will never stop. But it does. In the end, what remains? The money is gone. The private jets are scrap metal. The tour buses have been rusted out in junkyards. The screaming crowds have grown old and gray. What remains is the sound. Recorded music is the closest thing we have to immortality. It is a captured ghost. When you drop the needle on Searching for a Rainbow or stream Take the Highway, it is 1975 again. Toy is still thumb-picking. Doug is still screaming. And Tommy's still there. He is alive in the low frequencies. He's locked in with Paul Riddle. He is pushing the band forward. That silence between the notes, that pause, that is where Tommy lives now. He is the space between the heartbeats. He is the breath before the singer starts. He is the quiet confidence that tells you everything is going to be all right, even when the world is falling apart. He was the backbone. And though the body is broken, the bone remains. The Marshall Tucker Band gave the world a sound that defined a generation. But Tommy Caldwell gave the band its soul. So the next time you are driving down a highway at sunset, and that song comes on the radio, and you feel that urge to roll down the window and sing along, remember the man in the back. Remember the man with the cowboy hat and the Fender precision bass.